Un arī mūsu nākamā tēma ir saistīta ar biodegvielām, konkrēti ar biometānu. Un tāpēc es dodu vārdu HoSt Bioenergy Systems projektu attīstītājiem Jessam Buiteveldam. Mr. Buiteveld, do you hear us?
Yes, I do. I hope you can.
Yes, we can hear us.
Yes, excellent.
Yes. Thank you for joining, and the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. So thank you for this kind introduction. Also thanks to Martins to also introducing Bright Biomethane, which is part of the HoSt group. So I'll share my presentation with you now. So hopefully you can see my presentation as well.
Yes, we can see it.
Yes, excellent. Good morning, everyone. My name is Dienas Bizness. I'm a business developer at HoSt Bioenergy Installations. And today I'll be talking to you about support mechanisms for biomethane as a transportation fuel. So I'll start by giving you a general introduction. Then I want to discuss the Renewable Energy Directive with you. Of course, our first speaker of today, Penelope, also talked about our European goals with respect to sustainability. But I want to put a special focus on the transport sector. Next, I'll talk to you about support mechanisms for a good functioning supply with a special focus on biomethane. Then I'll discuss support mechanisms for a good functioning demand. Once again, focus on biomethane. And finally, I'll give 2 examples, also based on our own experience for the Netherlands and also for Germany. So Martins already gave an introduction to Bright Biomethane. I'll try to keep this short. So Bright is a part of the HoSt group. And HoSt is one of the biggest builders of bioenergy installations worldwide. So we're building biogas, so digestion installations, also gas upgrading, hence Bright, and also biomass combustion installations. And besides a builder of bioenergy installations, we're also owner and operator of several bioenergy installations, and of which 9 in total in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, we yearly produce over 130 gigawatt hours of biomethane annually. And my goal for today is to share our experience with the biomethane market with a special focus on the transportation sector. And what I'll try to do is to set a framework for a good functioning support mechanism to support biomethane for the transportation sector. And I also like to put in a little disclaimer that HoSt, that we are a biomethane producer, and so we're not a trader. So all I'll tell today is based on our own experience as a biomethane producer. So talking about the importance of biofuels in the transportation sector. So when looking in general to the transportation sector, of course, this sector needs to be more sustainable. And there are goals, European goals, and we basically can see 2 trends. So we can see for cars and for short distance transportation, we want to go for electrification, so electric vehicles. However, electrification is not possible for heavy transport and also not for marine transport. And here we can see that we're moving, for the heavy transport to hydrogen and LNG. For the marine fuels, we're more moving to LNG and methanol. And talking about LNG and methanol, this can both be bio-LNG, biomethanol, or synthetic LNG and methanol derived from blue or green hydrogen. Also, when looking at the marine sector, we can see there's a lot of discussion about using ammonia in the marine sector, but there's a lot of discussions over there regarding safety. So I personally don't think that ammonia will be used that much in the marine sector. It will be mostly methanol. And regarding biofuels, it's important to note that a differentiation is being made also in European legislation. So we have the conventional biofuels, which are the biofuels which are mostly used today. So they're derived from energy crops. So for example, ethanol coming from Brazil. We have the so-called other biofuels. They're actually from Part B, from Annex 9, from the Red 2. And these are biofuels derived from animal fats and from used cooking oils. And then we have the advanced biofuels, which is actually why we're here today. And these are from Part A, Annex 9 from the Red 2. And these are actually biofuels derived from waste. So this can be manure, or other agricultural waste, waste from the food industry, but also, for example, sewage sludge. And then if you take a closer look at the revised Renewable Energy Directive, or the RED 2, we can see that well, there are clear goals stated in the RED 2. It states that in 2030, member states must require fuel suppliers to supply a minimum of 14% of the energy consumed for road and rail transport as renewable energy. And we can actually see that some countries in Europe, they're even more ambitious. For example, Germany set a goal to have 25% of the fuel mix as sustainable fuels. And then when zooming in into this demand or this legislation for 14%, we can see that there's also a differentiation being made in the type of biofuel. And we can see that in 2022, only 0.2% should be of the total fuel mix should be derived from advanced biofuels, while in 2030, this should be 17 times more. So 3.4% of advanced biofuels, so derived from waste. And what's also really nice is that the RED 2 gives default values for the CO2 footprint of different types of biofuels derived from different types of systems and different types of feedstock. And that gives us a really good framework to work with. So when looking at the production side, we can see basically two things which are required for a biomethane producer to produce and sell biomethane, for example, to the transportation sector. First of all is grid entry. It's really important when producing biomethane that you can actually inject it into the national gas grid. And therefore we need clear criteria, for example, based on calorific value. So it need to be a certain value, there can be a certain bandwidth, of course, and the same goes for pollutants. So different types should be specified and a maximum which can be in the biomethane. And this requires also cooperation of the grid operators. So first we need clear criteria, and then of course grid operators should facilitate the grid entry. So they should be obliged. Doesn't mean that they, for example, have to pay for it, but as a biomethane producer, you should have the possibility to feed into the grid. And another thing that's also important is that you need to track biomethane. So if you produce biomethane, you need some kind of certificate to prove, okay, I have made this biomethane, it's derived from sustainable biomass, and then that certificate is worth money. And in order to do so, we need a central governmental organization, which first of all controls quality standards, but second of all also gives the opportunity to track biomethane production. And this can be done by supplying a certificate, a so-called guarantee of origin. So when looking at the demand side, also some support mechanisms needs to be in place. So there are clear regulations in the EU of mixing of biofuels. There's set goals. But first of all, of course, we need to make sure that we can control this, or at least see if actually the fuel mix is 14% sustainable in 2030. And this, once again, requires a guarantee of origin. And second of all, clear regulations needs to be in place for blending the biofuels. Therefore, we also need a central governmental organization which sets and controls the mixing of biofuels at fuel distribution points. So now what I want to share with you is, from our own experience, 2 examples. First of all, I want to focus on the Netherlands because that's where our main business is as a biomethane producer. So we can see that in the Netherlands, the grid operators have an obligation to supply grid entry. So when you build a biogas installation in the Netherlands and you say to the grid operators, okay, we want to feed into the grid, they're obliged to facilitate that. And in the Netherlands, we have a central governmental organization called Vertogas that provides a system of guarantee of origin. And on the other hand, we have the Dutch Emission Authority, or the Nederlandse Emissieautoriteit, the NEA, who controls the blending obligations on the other hand for biofuels. And then we can see that we have a system in place based on supply, based on demand, and that results in a certain value of biofuels. And what we can see in the Netherlands is not something that I fully support, so to say, is that we have a certain threshold value. So in the Netherlands, we say, okay, the produced biofuel should be below, should have a CO2 footprint below 20 grams of CO2 per megajoule, and then you're allowed to trade it as a renewable fuel unit, HBE, hernieuwbare brandstofeenheid. And what we can then see is that advanced biofuels, they are double counting. So instead of saying, okay, these advanced biofuels, so fuels derived from waste, so these fuels, they say, okay, we count them double, while on the other hand, for example, ethanol, it's single counting. And then when we look at the current prices in the Netherlands, you can see if you're a biomethane producer, so for example, from manure or from agricultural waste, the prices are in the range, because of the double counting, of 90 euros per megawatt hour. And in fact, this is higher than the national feed-in tariff we have on biomethane. So actually what we have done as a biomethane producer in the Netherlands is that we have stopped our feed-in tariff. So we said to the government, okay, we don't want the subsidy anymore. That allowed us to trade the certificates to the transportation sector and actually earn more money, while on the other hand, the government also didn't have to pay the subsidies. So that's a really nice system. But maybe what's even a better system, which is actually pretty similar to what we have in the Netherlands, is when we look at the German system. The only difference we have here is that when looking at Germany, the CO2 footprint of the biomethane is directly valued. And that's in accordance with the values stated in the RED II. So the default value stated in the RED II. And this actually gives a really nice incentive to the biomethane producers to be as sustainable as possible. So for example, you can think of using an off-gas system to reduce the amount of methane slip in the gas upgrading, or to have a closed digestate storage, also to prevent methane emissions, or having CO2 capture and liquefaction. And this system results in the fact that the more sustainable producers of biomethane actually get a higher price for the product. And prices were in Germany were in the range of 300 euros per ton of CO2, as that's based on the CO2 reduction in the fuel mix. And in fact, nowadays, we can see prices even as high as 400 euros per ton of CO2, resulting in prices, for example, for biomethane from waste, higher than 70 euros per megawatt hour, while looking at prices for biomethane derived from manure, slurries, they're even as high as 150 euros per megawatt hour. So I think, to conclude, there are 3 important things to put in place. First of all, you need to facilitate grid entry. Second of all, you need to track the biomethane by a guarantee of origin. And third of all, on the mixing side of the fuels, you need to have an organization who controls that actually a certain amount of biofuel is mixed in the mix. And when having that in place, that allows you as for example, as a country, that you don't actually need a feed-in tariff to support biomethane. If you just have the right instruments in play, then you just have demand and supply, which results in actually higher prices, higher revenues for the biomethane producers than a feed-in tariff. And that's all I had to say today. So these are my contact details. So if you want to contact me afterwards, you can send me an email, and I'll also be happy to answer any of your questions.
Presentation. I wanted to ask, how do you rate the current situation and the potential of the biomethane market in Latvia and in Europe?
Well, actually, in Latvia, I know there is a large agricultural sector, so that would also mean that there's quite a lot of agricultural waste, for example, manure, and we can see in general in Europe, also for example in the Netherlands, that there's a huge untapped potential in, for example, a digestion of manure. So I think, almost every country in Europe, there's a huge potential, and we just need to make sure that the biomass we use, or the agricultural waste, that it's actually waste, so not using food crops to produce biomethane. But I think there's a large potential in almost each European country, and especially countries like the Netherlands, like Latvia, who really focus, which really have a large agricultural sector.
Thank you very much for your time and for joining.